hope you can all hear me. I've got a borrowed computer, as I mentioned to some of you, and I've been warned that the sound isn't necessarily very good. So when Laura asked me to speak, I was not only amazed, but which I was, but then I was considering carefully and prayerfully. Is there a problem?
I think we're fine. It was just somebody off mute, so if we've muted them now, go on.
All right. Sorry, I was considering carefully and prayerfully what the Lord would want me to say. And so I hope that some of the words I'm able to share with you tonight are of some help to someone. But I just want to say, as I speak about my prayer life this evening, I've learned along the last few years that one of the reasons the church has many orders, many orders, is because human beings in the rich diversity of personality that we've been given have many ways to the Lord, and their prayer life is very variable, and there's nothing wrong with that. And so what draws somebody to life as a Dominican may not be the same as what draws somebody to life as a parish priest. They're both drawn in a desire to serve the Lord, but they're drawn to be part of a particular spiritual way of life. So please don't presume that I'm advertising a particular form of prayer for you. Right, so let me take you back to something that happened to me in 2012. So I'd gone through a life in Catholic teaching. I had hardly ever been on a retreat of any kind, except one or two that were sort of imposed on head teachers, and that's not quite the same as choosing to go on one. So in late 2012, Judith, my wife, said, would you like to go on an Advent retreat? And I thought, well, why not? So we went to Loyola Hall in Advent 2012, and I was rather startled. It hadn't occurred to me that there'd be some silence involved. I wasn't sure that I could cope with silence, but anyway, that's what I found on arrival. And so there were some speaking times, but there were quite a lot of silent times. It was also the situation, as in retreat centres generally, that the rooms are all single, and the silence should include not speaking to Judith and Judith not speaking to me, and outside certain set times. And that was a bit of a novelty, to say the least. But I find I rather enjoyed those times of silence. And I read a book, well, parts of a book on the Eucharist, and I found the library very interesting and good, and the talks were good, and some prayer time was good. And the desire I had before I left, I was drawn to choose a book and buy it and take it away. And here's the book I bought. It's called Prism of Love, God's Colours in Everyday Life. What it's fundamentally doing is it's a priest who served in Yorkshire at the time he wrote the book. So he was in the Leeds diocese, and he was writing about the everyday things of his ordinary life, from his ministry through to his sore throat, to anything you like, and reflecting on where God was in that. And shortly after that was Christmas. I didn't read the book over Christmas, but in the new year, not long into the new year, we had a big trip planned, and Judith and I were busy, and at the end of January, beginning of February, off we went on our wonderful big trip. I've got 3 sisters and lots of relatives in Australia, so we're going to see them, but we're also going on holiday in New Zealand. And our time in New Zealand and Australia covered the whole of Lent. And on the first day of Lent, I picked up the book and I read the first chapter. Now, that's not a very proud achievement. It was a page and a half long. And all the chapters were similar, page to 2 pages. And what we immediately did was, whether we were staying in a hostel or a hotel or a bed and breakfast, whatever it was, we started our day by each of us in turn reading one of these little reflections to the other, and then sitting and thinking about it before the Lord. So I found that very good. It really, really was good. And when we came back, dramatic things had happened, but the dramatic things happened mostly while we were away. And there were dramatic things happening. A pope had stepped down from the papacy, and there was a conclave. And I avidly followed all this going on. It's quite possible to follow it in New Zealand, by the way, and it was fascinating. So there we were through Lent, going through this as these remarkable events were occurring. And on Wednesday, the 13th of March, we had a new pope. And I now say that I've become what I colloquially like to call a new Franciscan, because the arrival of Pope Francis had the most dramatic impact on my life, the most dramatic impact on my spiritual life. It really did dramatically impact me. I've always been a person attracted to service, Christian service of various kinds. I've been in 3 or 4 different parishes in the SVP, for example. So service appeals to me, service of the Lord. And it appeals to my inner spirit deeply. And when the Pope was elected and started to minister, I couldn't take my eyes off the newscasts and so on. I was fascinated. He was the big personality of the year, you may recall. And on Maundy Thursday, 15 days after the election, he didn't do what was expected. The Lateran Basilica, in all its finery, was expecting the Pope to lead the Maundy Thursday evening service, and he didn't. Others did. There was a cardinal or 2 there, a few bishops and so on, but he was in a penitentiary for youth, celebrating the service with them, kneeling down, washing the feet of teenagers, of both boys and girls, and kissing their feet. That moved me profoundly. I cannot overemphasize how profoundly that moved me. And a succession of other things moved me very deeply, very, very deeply. There was a group of people shipwrecked, rescued from the Mediterranean, who were escaping from wherever they'd been in trial and tribulation, and landing on Lampedusa, a small Italian island. And the Pope went there to see them and so on. But I also became fascinated by one of the little news items I came across, and I then found I could get it quite regularly. It involved the work of somebody I'd never heard of, an office called the Papal Almoner. And Pope Francis changed the life of this papal almoner, because in the past he'd been allowed to get on with his job pretty unhindered, but daily a messenger came from the Pope's office to the Papal Almoner's office with the day's correspondence that the Pope had received, with little notes on it to the Papal Almoner. Would you do this about this? Would you please do such and such and such and such? And some of them were absolutely astonishing things. And sometimes there wasn't a letter, there was just a note to the almoner, would you do such and such? And they were so imaginative. So when you read that the almoner is asked to buy a mobile phone for all the people who've been rescued from that shipwreck and were on Lampedusa, and to give them a mobile phone with 50 euros credit on it, and to give it to them and ask them to do all they could to contact their families to let them know they were all right, you realize that this is extraordinary. And all the extraordinary things that occurred moved me to ask a fundamental question. Where has Pope Francis got this spirituality from? What's at the root of it? What motivates him? And clearly it was to do with his love of God and God's children. And so I saw a huge significance in his choice of Francis as a name, and in his heritage of 50 years as a priest, a Jesuit priest, And there was something I didn't know anything about called Ignatian spirituality that was the hallmark of Jesuit life. And I had to find out, what is it about Francis that he's chosen that name? What is it about Jesuit spirituality that motivates him and gets him to be feeling and thinking as he is and acting as he is? And so now, 7 years later, I'm still exploring Ignatian spirituality. It didn't take me long to get a book of the life of St. Francis and read it and be moved by it. It didn't take me too long to start to find out about Ignatian spirituality, but I'm still searching. And the Pope's prayer life particularly fascinated me. There's got to be a deep prayer to power the activities, the actions that I so profoundly found so profoundly moving. It really was wonderful to me. In one of those actions, he welcomed to Rome the senior Orthodox Patriarch. I had read that some hundreds of years earlier, when the same person, a person with the same office, had asked his emissary to ask at the Vatican, would he be welcome to visit St. Peter's and the Pope to see the shrine of St. Peter, he had been told he would be welcome to visit, provided he went through the usual protocols when he arrived. So the emissary said, well, what are the usual protocols? And one of them was to kiss the Pope's slipper. So when in 2013, when the current patriarch visited to see and to pray at the shrine of St. Peter, to see the Pope welcoming him at the door, escorting him in, and when it came to the flight of steps down to the tomb, saying to the patriarch, after you, we realize that this is a different way of looking and being, a different way of relating to our fellow Christians. And there were many other examples of how he related to fellow Christians, both from his time in Argentina and once he was in Italy. And those all moved me because I was involved in an ecumenical charity that I come to dearly appreciate many people's wonderful faith from all sorts of denominations. On the 24th of November of 2013, the document Evangelii Gaudium was published, a wonderful document, The Joy of the Gospel. Shortly afterwards, in the charity where I was helping, another volunteer who's a young Anglican curate said to me, have you read The Joy of the Gospel? Well, I was reading it, and he said, isn't it wonderful? He said, I belong to the Anglican Diocese of Chester's Young Curates Group, and we meet monthly and share a book which we discuss on our next meeting. He said, we're reading The Joy of the Gospel, and we all think it's fantastic. So those sort of things I found very uplifting. So I had the then great blessing shortly afterwards of going to a meeting in our parish that happened once a month. I didn't usually go, but I went this particular time. It was a meeting for Catholics. It was noted to be pretty cerebral, this stuff. It was usually a talk by somebody very learned for the people of great brain power, I think. But I went along anyway. And before it turned out to be the annual general meeting, which isn't too cerebral at all. But just before it, one of the members gave a little talk, and she talked about her work as a prayer guide. And I found that very interesting. And after the meeting, I went and spoke to her. That resulted in her and another prayer guide offering to lead a week of guided prayer, because I said, we want help with our prayer. And we want to be praying a bit more like the Pope, you see. And she said, right, well, would you like a week of guided prayer? And without going into detail, we arranged the week of guided prayer, and we sent out 2,000 handbills and 120 posters to churches all over the place, and invited people to a meeting. 30 people turned up, and 2 people came along. 28 people turned up, and we had we had a wonderful week of guided prayer, but many other things followed. And without boring you too long, it led to Judith and I being advised that to take our Ignatian interests further, we should look at the sort of equivalent of a third order of the Jesuits. It's called Christian Life Communities. They're in countries all over the world. And there was a regional meeting due in the Northwest, so Judith and I went along. And that led to us becoming members of this Christian Life community. And for the last 7 years, we've been going to fortnightly prayer meetings. And I describe these prayer meetings as like the pillars on a suspension bridge. We pray daily, and fortnightly we meet, and it's like the pillars holding up the fortnight in between. You can see the image, can't you? Now, when we did the week of guided prayer, on the initial meeting, the lady leading said, "I'd like you each to tell me, or tell us, what you most want from this week." And each person said something. I didn't know what I was going to say, but when it came to my turn, I found myself, to my surprise, saying, "I want to learn to listen to God. I want to learn to listen to God." 7 years on from that point, 6 or 7 years, I'm still wanting to learn to listen to God rather more than I've so far managed. But it is a wonderful thing to be, as it were, given those words on that day, because it made me realize what it was that was in my heart. It came out through my mouth without my brain interfering, I think. In my personal prayer now, I try to pray every morning. If it's not in the morning, I try and fit it in as soon as I can. And I pray usually whatever has been agreed by the group at their fortnightly meetings. We take it in turns to research and suggest for the rest of the group, and then we prayerfully discern. We have a style of prayer which is very much silent contemplation on some basis. So this morning I was contemplating very carefully and on our agreed theme, which is faith, and there were readings connected to that. In 2014, I was moved to make a New Year's resolution for the 1st of January 2015, and I've never made one in my entire life. So being drawn to make a New Year's resolution is a bit odd. It was for me. And I said to Judith, "Can I tell you about my New Year's resolution I'd like to make? And could I ask you, would you think of joining me?" And the New Year's resolution was in 2 parts. The first part was that I wanted to resolve that, having been involved with a charity where there were people from other faiths and going to meetings of the local Churches Together committee, it seemed bizarre that I'd never been at any of their church services except the Catholic one. So I said, we go to the Sunday Mass in the mornings most weeks, but once a month we go to the evening Mass because we're Eucharistic ministers. I said, I'd like to experience the other churches in the morning on the week when we go to the evening Mass. So once a month we did that. The other part of the resolution was to begin to go towards doing the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola by doing an 8-day silent retreat, which I did. And I'll tell you about that now because it's quite significant. So in the beautiful summer weather of 2015, that's right, 2015, beautiful summer weather, I'm on retreat. I arrive for 8 days of silent retreat, 8 days totally silent except talking to the prayer guide once in the morning. So I'm on this silent retreat, well, we are, in 2 single rooms, and we are sharing a cottage down the road and walking backwards and forwards in silence each day. And it was wonderful. And several significant things happened. One day, I think the second day, I was on a beautiful walk, and I was looking as I walked up this steep hill behind the centre across towards Llandudno and the mountains of Snowdon. And what I recognised was that that's where I'd spent all my childhood holidays on the hillside, looking the opposite way. And I felt so blessed. And on that walk, which was about 2 hours, I only met one other person. And it was my wife coming the opposite way. And that was quite extraordinary. And in the silence, we stood in a lane halfway around the walk. She was doing it in reverse to me. And we hugged one another. And I don't know whether we said anything or not. We probably did say something, I should think, in those circumstances. But on the 4th day of this retreat, I was given certain texts to pray with, and I went upon the hillside within the grounds of this centre, and I sat on the top terrace, and I looked towards the exact spot where I'd spent these childhood holidays, and I had a most intense spiritual experience, which was this. I was praying, and I was completely alone in this huge garden, and unlike me, I assure you, I found myself standing up and singing praises to God, lines from this psalm and so on, because I had this intense image of the room in which I'd had all my meals as a child on that holiday, that there was a window and a seat in front of it that I used to kneel on, and my dad used to help me hold up binoculars and tell me what I was looking at. And my parents were deeply loving, deeply prayerful people. And I had this deep sense on this hillside in this prayer that there were my parents staring down at me in this situation and telling me they still love me, they're still praying for me and thinking of me and caring for me in heaven, and that they were utterly, utterly delighted by where I was and what was happening to me. And in the middle of all this ecstasy and joy, which were fantastic, I did something I don't ever do in prayer. I stopped to write 2 things down. Usually I write down at the end about what I've been doing in prayer. It's my little prayer journal. I've got a few volumes of it now. The first one was started there on that retreat. 2 weeks after this retreat, I hadn't looked at my prayer journal, and I went and looked. And in that journal, I found these 2 things I'd written. And one was somebody's name, and the other was the term Hope Centre Friends. So what was in my heart and mind at the time that I was on that hillside praying, that day I'd been thinking about the trials and tribulations of my parish life, which I was feeling very sorry for myself over the life in my parish. Probably not a good idea to feel too sorry for yourself, but I was. But the Lord was telling me, I'm sure, that my Hope Centre friends, my charity activities that were all ecumenical, I've sent you that blessing. Don't complain about your parish life, Tony. I thought that's what he's telling me. But the other bit really puzzled me, because the other bit was a name of somebody who'd been a parent at the school that I'd retired from 10 years before. And somebody I knew a little, but not tremendously well. So I was a bit puzzled. And when I looked at it, I thought, well, I ought to see this person. So I rang up Rachel Mackay and went to see her, as she invited me to come around, which I'd asked, and sat in her garden for an hour or 2. Well, it's an hour and a bit, actually. And I probably poured out my heart to her about the problems of my life before, that I won't go into, and many other things, and described the scene on that hillside and so on. And then I stopped, and after a pause, Rachel said, "May I ask what the text was that you were praying with?" And I told her it was a certain psalm and 4 verses of that psalm. So that has a reference number, the number of the psalm and verses, say 3 to 7, yeah? And we both sat there in silence for a moment, or perhaps it seemed quite a while. And then Rachel said something quite remarkable. She said to me, "Those 4 verses are the most significant verses of scripture for me." She said, "That's John and my PIN number." When we both recovered our composure, by the way, I've now found there are just short of 32,000 verses in the Bible. But by the way, when we both recovered our composure, it dawned on Rachel that she ought to be going to pick her children up from school. So practicalities came in, and off we went. But she did mention 2 things to me. One, that John was reading a book, which she was hoping to read after him, and that I might like to read it. Many of you will know the book, Divine Renovation, and I have read it. And the other was, she said, you might like to try an Alpha course. I think I did 5 in the next 12 months, but so I'll cut away from that and say several things happened. Am I out of time, Laura? Yeah. Several things happened that I will share with you. I've got far too many notes here, but I'll just tell you some things that happened. In the January following, our priest was going for his usual month in Ireland. And before that, he wanted some people to do services of word and communion on the weekdays while he was away. And I volunteered, and he said, thank you. And I wanted to prepare. So I heard that that St. Peter's Hazel Grove did some very good services of word and communion. So I rang Peter Sherrocks, and he advised me to speak to Julie Williams. And Julie agreed to meet me and showed me some resources and gave me some ideas. And then I said to Judith, well, no substitute for going to sea. So let's go along to one. And so we went to the next one, which was the following Wednesday. And we went to the second row in St. Peter's Church in good time before the service. And there were 2 young ladies in front of us. And when it came to 12 o'clock, these 2 young ladies got up. And they went and they led a service of word and communion. And it was an excellent service. And after the service, they went and sat back down in front of Judith and I. And then from my far right, opposite side of the church almost, Rachel came across and said to me, do you recognize these 2 young ladies? And I said, no, I'm sorry, I don't. And then Rachel introduced me to them. And they were David and Laura's daughter, Jenny, and Rachel and John's daughter, Sarah. I would guess they were about 17, 18. And I'd not seen them since they were 7, so I hope they're my excuse for not recognizing them. But when experiencing that, I felt quite remarkably moved inside by the Spirit. I've been drawn to do something and sought guidance, and the Lord had drawn me to see the example of these 2 young ladies. So I asked them a question. I said, that was wonderful. How often have you done it? And they said, this is our first time. I feel profoundly blessed to have had the Lord teach me something of his service in that way. Profoundly blessed. I can't give enough thanks to the Lord for that blessing. Over the next couple of years, 1 or 2 other helpful coincidences, shall we say, or as a friend of mine likes to call them, God instances, occurred. In 2017, I was unfortunate enough to get a nasty bout of flu and be in Stepping Hill Hospital. I was whisked into a big ward, but not in the big ward, stuck away in a side cubicle with a solid wooden door. And the first morning, the door was a knock on the door, and the door opened, and there was Rachel Mackay with communion for the person who'd been in that room the day before, and rather startled to find me. And I was just astonished to find her there, because I couldn't have wished for anything more than somebody to bring communion. Another instance, and I'd just stop after that. A year or two later, I'd gone on an errand, and on my way back to where we live in Marple, I'd been passing through Hazel Grove, and I had to get some shopping, and I went into M&S, and my car was in the car park. I came out, got out of the car, and coming towards me across the neighbouring car park of the next door store was a figure I recognised. It was a lady I knew from one of our prayer groups, and she walked towards me crying. She'd had some devastating personal news, and she was so pleased to see me. She'd just come away from the midday mass at St. Peter's, and there was I. I've only ever been in that place where she found me about 3 times in my life. So the chances of her finding me, who she particularly wanted to find me, would have chosen to see me. And I walked her home and held her hand and comforted her. And in the conversation, it seemed she'd had somebody else comforting her at the end of Mass. She'd had a very helpful conversation with Rachel Mackay. So Rachel and I can't find enough words to thank the Lord for the blessings that those coincidences, shall we say, have been to me. My prayer life isn't getting easier, by the way, but I've read things by great prayer guides that that's not supposed to necessarily happen. The great bliss of my meditation and contemplation on the hillside and meeting Rachel is the reward for an early stage in prayer. It's not the way the Lord promises to keep it going. The road to heaven passes through the Garden of Gethsemane with prayer silently and without asking the Lord to take away what you want to be taken away, but what's his will. I'm going to end by reading something from this little book, Prism of Love. It's the book I had in Australia and New Zealand, where we read it a section a day between Judith and I. When I conclude this reading, I'd like to invite you to join me in 2 minutes of silence to contemplate whatever the Lord puts into your mind and heart. I'll conclude the 2 minutes by saying thank you, and then it's over to Fran and Dave. I hope that's all right. It's anticipating Christmas, and it's a bit early, so excuse that. So this particular contemplation is called The Power of a Baby. True love, and the subheading is True Love Can Only Be Vulnerable. A young father once said to me, "When my baby was born, I lost my stammer. So many family conflicts are healed, so much brokenness mended when a baby is born. I have seen cold atmospheres melt in minutes when a baby is brought into a room. I have seen hard features grow gentle and break into a smile when a small baby kicks its feet and claps its hands in the purest of new joy. Such is the power of a baby. There is the fear-filled power of a dictator and the love-filled power of a baby. For thousands of years before the first Christmas, it was the crushing control of an avenging monarch that the righteous people expected to see as the new Messiah. Imagine the amazement of the universe when the long-awaited Almighty God of creation turned up as a delighted baby, sucking his toes and his mother's breast Here was the cosmic king of all time and of all space, as a tiny tot in diapers, surrounded by donkey pee and cattle dung. After 2,000 years, I'm quite convinced we've not yet recovered from the shock. Perennially, we miss the raw meaning of Christmas. We get caught up in the pretty trappings of cribs, cards, and carols, missing the radical nature of the revelation that God's essence is perfectly expressed in the features and form of a vulnerable baby. Superficial, sentimental, or sugary expressions of the coming feast serve only to miss entirely the radical extravagance of God, whose unconditional and obsessive love for us will stop at nothing, however dangerous, dirty, or demeaning the circumstances. In our annual representations of the Bethlehem cave, it is worse than foolish to clean up the mess, polish up the manger, remove the nappy and the potty, throw in a few halos, and have flying angels all over the place. As we know from Matthew and Luke, it was not like that at all. When God became human, there was no pretending. It was not always a pretty sight. It was, in fact, the real thing. Life without frills. It was also an amazing risk on God's part, something that could have gone dreadfully wrong. In a sense, it did go dreadfully wrong, horribly wrong. The baby who came into the world in a mess went out of it as an adult in a bigger mess. The infancy narratives are Advent readings written long after the death and resurrection, recapitulate and anticipate the mysterious moments of his amazing life. The Christmas account is a kind of resume or script of his destiny, of what was written in his stars. All those death-filled and life-filled moments add up to a nativity story of incredible love. And the small sacrament of this wonder is an infant in a manger. Such is the power of a baby. When loving couples have a baby, they become as vulnerable and precarious as the baby of their love. The beauty they have created shatters their former security. Their lives as irrevocably transformed. But that is what love is like. It surrenders. It has no more masks, no more expectations, no more certainties. The Bethlehem baby's defenseless presence, his shocking and precarious weakness, his overturning of all our ideas about the nature of God, stun us into silence. It is in this sacred silence, during the next few precious days, that the hard thoughts within us will melt, that the unforgiving walls of judgment and blame will crumble, and the shadows of our pride will be transformed by the light of an infant's smile. Such is the power of a baby. I invite you now, be still and know that I am God. Be still and know that I am. Be still and know. Be still. Thank you.